Hi folks, this is Nat, and this is your video lesson on adding and subtracting decimals. So the thing that I'm going to stress here is that, and some of you are going to hate to hear this, but this is going to be a no calculator lesson. We're going to be focusing on how you do these computations by hand. Most of the time we let you use a calculator so that you can speed through them, but you do need to know how to do this stuff on your own. So let's start with the number one most important rule when you are adding and subtracting decimals, and that is this. No matter what, you need to line up the decimals. You cannot add or subtract unless you line up the decimals, and there's a really good reason for that. We'll talk about why. Let's say I'm doing this problem, 24 3/10 plus 8 65/100. If I don't line up the decimals, and I do what some people do, which is write the numbers so that they line up with their last places, regardless of what those are, I would set it up this way. I'd say 24 3/10 plus 8 65/100. And here's the problem. When the decimals are not lined up, my place values are not lined up. My places are not lined up. So you can look here at this 3, and what I'm going to be doing when I add is adding 3/10 to 5/100, which really doesn't work. Same thing over here. I'm going to be adding 4 wholes to 6/10. Again, these things don't make sense. 4 wholes plus 6/10 is 4 wholes and 6/10. 3/10 plus 5/100 is 3/10 and 5/100, 35/100. So we're setting ourselves up to fail here if we don't line up the decimals. A lot of the time I encourage students to do this on graph paper and actually put their decimal place in first, or their decimal in first. And that way I know they're lined up and I can say, okay, 24 3/10, 8 65/100. And what that does is exactly what we were talking about a second ago. It lines up all the place values right from the get-go. I've got 3/10 being added to 6/10, tenths to tenths, and I have 4 wholes being added to 8 wholes, wholes to wholes, ones place to ones place. So that's going to make this actually work. And when I go ahead and add, I'll be adding all the places correctly. And so, most importantly, I'm going to add these things correctly. The actual addition and subtraction parts of this tend to be things that students are very good at, and it's not something I'm particularly worried about. So we're going to talk about some mistakes that you might actually make, because they're mistakes we see sixth graders making every year. So we already talked about one of them and why. So mistake to avoid number one is not lining up the decimals. This is really more of a thoughtless, careless error than anything else. But remember, we don't do the addition or subtraction unless our decimals are lined up. Most of the rest of the mistakes that we see regularly have to do with subtraction. And here's a big one, number 2. That's not filling empty places with zeros, or we might think of this as not borrowing. Let me show you what this mistake looks like. Here I've set up a subtraction problem. And you all know how to subtract, and normally you do it perfectly well. The mistake people will make in this scenario is forgetting that just because there's no hundredths place here, it doesn't mean there's no value there. So what I see people frequently do is just say, well, if there's nothing there, I'll just bring down my 1. Here's the problem, is basically what's happened is it's like saying 6 minus 8 and calling it 2. Saying, well, if I did 6 minus 8, I'd go into negative numbers, so I'll just do 8 minus 6 instead. Because what you are functionally doing there is you are saying, okay, there's a 0 there, and 0 minus 1 is 1. Well, that's actually not close to true. When we solve a problem like this, the easiest way to avoid that mistake is to fill extra zeros into the empty spaces so that each of our decimals is the same number of spaces or goes to the same place. So I might begin by filling in 0 hundredths to remind myself when I go to subtract that 1 that I'm actually going to need to subtract for real. So most of you, if you saw the 0, would say, oh, I can't take 1 from 0, so I'm going to need to borrow. So I'm going to turn my 6 into a 5 and borrow a whole. So 10 minus 1 makes 9, really different than 1. Okay, 5 minus 4, we can just keep going through this. And it's the same thing we'll be doing over here. You all are used to this borrowing idea. You just need to remember to do it way down here at the beginning. So let's avoid that mistake. So those are the two big mistakes that we see when we are adding and subtracting decimals, and if we can avoid those, we'll be in pretty good shape. We're going to make this a pretty quick video lesson, but let's end with just one example of all this kind of coming together. We're going to be focusing mostly on word problems, since I think the computation parts of this should be fairly familiar to you. So let's look at this one. You bought 6 pounds of bacon and used 821 thousandths pounds in an omelet. How many do you have left? Hopefully, as we look at that, the first thing we recognize is this is a subtraction problem. I can look at the question, how many do you have left, as a subtraction style question. I'm asking how many are remaining. So I'll be subtracting. So I started with 6 pounds. Now, this is a little bit weird because my bacon that I used is in decimal format, and the bacon I bought is in a whole number format. So I'm going to have to change my whole number so that it's usable. So I've got 6 pounds, and then there's a decimal, and since I'm going to the thousandths place, I'm going to go ahead and write all those zeros in to help me remember to subtract correctly. And I'll subtract 821 thousandths. So that'll be the setup here. And since I can't just plug this into my calculator, I'm going to need to be very thoughtful about all my borrowing and stuff like that. There's going to be a bunch of chain borrowing here, so I need to obviously start down here at my 6 and borrow from it, make it a 5, and that'd be more tenths. I'll borrow from those tenths, make that a 9, that'd be more hundredths. I'll borrow from those, make that a 9, and then I'll borrow down to my thousandths place. So I end up with 10 thousandths, which will get me started. I had to do that because, again, I can't just say, well, I'll take 1 from 0 by calling it 1. I have to borrow until I can actually do it. So 10 minus 1 is 9. Over here in the hundredths place, 9 minus 2 is 7. 9 minus 8 is 1. And 5 minus nothing is 5. So I have 5 and 179 thousandths pounds of bacon remaining. The things I'm going to point out about this problem are mostly the mistakes that we talked about that I avoided. I began the problem by lining up my decimals and making sure all my places lined up with their matching places in the two numbers. And then the other thing I did was filled in a bunch of zeros here to help me not mess up my borrowing when it was time to subtract. And here are your practice problems for the lesson. Hopefully this is feeling pretty manageable. A lot of old skills here, just applying them to decimals, which might be review for you. So complete these two problems, bring them in, and good luck.